Chapter 6. Despite our haste, it took us 2 full days to reach London. Our passage was uneventful and our conversation limited. We slept the night in Bedford, and in late afternoon of the following day, I first caught sight of the rooftops of the great city on the Thames. The volume of traffic had swelled threefold. We passed carts and wagons of every size and description. Full ones on their way into the city, empty ones coming back. Apparently, London had an enormous appetite for goods of every kind, from livestock and vegetables to timber and stone. In my poor parish, most of what we used came from the farms round about. It was curious to think of carting in food and materials from all over the country. We approached the city on Aldersgate Street. All around us lay fields and orchards. I might have imagined I had never left home had I not looked dead ahead, where the 1,000 buildings of the city, with their red tile roofs, lay ranged in rows within the ancient stone wall, so densely packed that those which lined the river seemed about to be nudged into it by those on the hill above. "Close your mouth," Falconer said, "before your soul flies out." Embarrassed, I clamped my mouth shut and urged my horse forward. By the time we passed through the wall at Aldersgate, the sun had set, and the streets were growing dark. There was much less bustle and clamour than I had expected. I was, in truth, a bit disappointed. We had gone no more than 100 yards before a man carrying a pikestaff and a bell, leading a mastiff on a leash, stalked up to us. "You're to lead your horses within the walls." Falconer reined in. I watched him anxiously, wondering how he would respond to this order. To my surprise, he swung from his saddle without a word, though his bearing spoke of resentment and disdain, and walked on, leading his mount. I dropped to the cobblestones and hurried after. My eyes were on Falconer, not on my footing. I stumbled into a deep depression in the ground and landed painfully on one knee. The watchman burst out laughing. "You're a green one, aren't you?" I was tempted to reply that where I came from, we did not leave holes in the street for people to fall into, but I thought better of it and limped off with my horse in tow. Now I saw that the depression was in fact a ditch that ran the length of the street. I also became aware of the noisome stench arising from it. Falconer growled. "Must I watch you every moment like an arrant sheep?" I couldn't help it. I fell in that ditch. "Then you have reason to act sheepish. That's the sewer." He waved a hand at me as though to keep me at distance. "Be sure you walk downwind of me from here on." I saw at once that Falconer was no stranger to London. He made his way through the streets with such an air of assurance, indeed of arrogance, that those few townsfolk still abroad gave him a wide berth. Or perhaps it was due to the air about me. Even in the dark, the buildings that towered over us were impressive. Some were a full 4 stories high. In one block, the fronts of the buildings were decorated with beaten gold. To our right, a huge cathedral was silhouetted against the rising moon. As I stared at it, the bells in its square steeple rang the hour of compline. "Stop gawking and move your pins," Falconer called. "That's the curfew bell." "London has a curfew?" I asked incredulously. "The largest and most cosmopolitan city in England, the symbol of freedom to thousands upon thousands of country youths, compelled its citizens to be off the streets at 9 o'clock? Falconer strode on without replying. We passed the public stocks, which were empty, then came upon a spot where 3 streets diverged like a trident. Falconer took the right-hand prong, and we walked another several blocks before we stopped under a sign which depicted St. George slaying a rather pitiful-looking dragon. "This will be our lodgings," Falconer said. "If we should become separated, find your way here. Just ask anyone for the George near the 4 corners. Understood?" "Aye, the George near the 4 corners." "Otherwise you are to talk to no one. Is that understood?" Aye. He handed me the reins of his mount. Take the horses through that archway to the stable. I started off, but his voice made me turn back. One more thing, aye. Stop saying aye. I will, I promised. Yes, I told myself as I led the horses into the courtyard. Not I, yes, 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 yes. Anything that would make me appear more like a Londoner and less like a green country woodcock I was more than willing to adopt. But if I truly did not wish to be sniggered at, my first task would have to be to change my reeking clothing. The main room of the inn where we supped was enormous, with a wide fireplace and half a dozen massive tables. At each table sat 4 or 5 patrons, some eating, some drinking, some playing at dice. As I sat opposite Falconer, gobbling my bread and herring, a quarrel kindled among the dice players. 2 men sprang to their feet, their hands reaching for their rapiers, but a third man stepped between them. There was a moment's heated discussion. Then one of the antagonists stalked from the room wearing a grim look. Falconer seemed to take no notice of the scene. There was nearly a fight, I whispered. There will be one yet, he said. They've merely chosen another time and place. You mean a duel over a game of dice? He shrugged, and his hood moved a little, revealing the long scar that traversed his cheek. Some men will fight over nearly anything. We finished our supper in silence. When Falconer started up to his room, I hastened after him. He waved me away with an impatient gesture, as if I still stank, though I had done my best to wash thoroughly. You will make your bed in the stables, boy. I backed away, surprised and a bit hurt. Simon Bass had led me to believe that my part in this mission, as he had called it, was an important one. But to Falconer, I was apparently no more than an unskilled and incompetent prentice, not fit to converse with or share a room with. In truth, I was, except perhaps for my diet, no better than his horses. For 3 days we sat idle at the inn, waiting for the Lord Chamberlain's men to perform the tragedy of Hamlet. There was a different play each afternoon, and Hamlet would not be presented until Tuesday. I spent much of the time watching the traffic that thronged the streets. Every conceivable conveyance passed by, from rude carts to fine coaches, and every conceivable class of person. Ragged street urchins begging for farthings, fat merchants in sensible clothing, young dandies in doublets so extravagantly slit and slashed as to appear ready to fall off. Dozens of prentices my age or younger, all wearing the same style of woolen cap. The cries of street vendors mingled in a kind of exotic music. Quick periwinkles, quick, quick! Fine Seville oranges, fine lemons. Ah, ripe cowcumbers, ripe! Sweep! Chimbly sweep, mistress, from bottom to top. No soot then shall fall in your porridge pot. Ha, you any rats, mice, polecats or weasels, or any old cows sick of the measles? I occupied several hours transcribing these cries, partly because they were so colourful, partly to exercise my stenography. I had never witnessed a play, except for a few short interludes played on the bed of a wagon in the town square at May Festival, so I had little idea of what to expect. How long would the performance last? Half an hour? 6 hours? How rapidly would the players speak? What about their actions? Should I transcribe them as well? What if they recited in Latin or Greek? I longed to ask Falconer all these things, but I knew what his reply would be. He would glare at me and tell me to wait and see. So I sat about the courtyard and the stable, and like a good prentice, I waited. On Tuesday, after a midday meal of fried fish and oysters, we set out for the theatre. We followed a narrow unpaved street downhill to the Thames, and I was suddenly presented with a whole different aspect of the city. Here were no gold-plated buildings or great cathedrals, only shabby rows of houses cheek by jowl. With no space to spread sidewise, they had arched over the street, like the trees on that desolate stretch of road where we had met the outlaws, nearly meeting above our heads, shutting out the sun. There were no street vendors here, nor prosperous merchants, only sullen wives emptying their slop jars into the street, sometimes missing the scrawny, shoeless children playing there, sometimes not. Falconer strode heedlessly along, as if daring anyone to empty a chamber pot on his head. No one did. One house had been boarded up, and a crude wooden cross nailed to its front door. Beneath the cross were scrawled the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." "Is that a church?" I said. Falconer gave a derisive laugh. "That's a plague house, boy." I shuddered. Though the plague had not been widespread in our parish, Dr. Bright had treated enough cases for me to know why that plea for mercy had been painted upon the door. Ever since we left the inn, my stomach had been growing distressed, and the stench that hung in the stagnant air on that street did nothing to improve it. I laid the blame on the fried fish and oysters I had eaten, but it might have been due to nervousness. Suddenly, I was unsure that I was up to the task of copying a whole play, and if I failed, Falconer would not be pleased. I would have pleaded illness, but I knew that Falconer would brook no excuse short of my writing hand being lopped off, and even then he would probably insist I transcribe left-handed. At the end of the street, a set of narrow stone steps led to the water's edge. Falconer took them two at a time. I followed more cautiously, and caught up just as he was handing several pennies to a waterman with a small wherry boat. "Get in," Falconer said. "In the boat?" I had never imagined the theatre would lie across the river. "No, in the water," he said acidly, and I hoped sarcastically. It was no use protesting that I had never set foot in a boat in my life, and I did not care to now, or if the craft were to capsize I would be lost, for I had never learned to swim. There was nothing to do but to swallow my fear and step into the insubstantial bottom of the boat, which was all that lay between me and the land of Rumbelow, that is to say, a watery grave. I took my place in the stern, and sat gripping the gunwales with white-knuckled hands, while Falconer climbed in, rocking the boat sickeningly, and the wherryman cast off. Without the solid earth beneath my feet, my stomach grew even queasier. Before we were halfway across, I felt my dinner coming up. I tried to hold it back, and failing, thrust my head over the side of the boat and threw my fish back into the Thames whence it had come. Unfortunately, I leaned out a bit too far. The boat listed suddenly, and I toppled over the side.